Aurora's Awakening by Elfie Fae Beauchamp. Prologue. An icy late October wind whipped up and rattled the shutters of the dilapidated two-story farmhouse sleeping silently in the Springfield neighborhood, save for a single candle burning on the second-story window overlooking the street. The sounds of the early morning Missouri traffic rippled around the house in waves, the occasional siren piercing through the calm before settling down in a dull roar again. The phone rang in Adele's ear for the fourth time, and for the fourth time she was taken to the voicemail box. "Hey, it's Aurora. You know what to do." Beep. Adele couldn't hide the tremor in her voice a fourth time. "Hey, Rory, it's Grandma again. I'm sorry to keep bugging you, babe. This old house is really just rattling me tonight." Her voice broke, and she cleared her throat. It was starting to tighten with the tears threatening to fall. Flashbacks of that night so many years ago, trying desperately to get a hold of her daughter, gripping her brain with a vice-like hold. If you could come hang out, I would really appreciate the company. I just really don't want to be alone tonight." She hung up the phone and set it on the nightstand. The two cards she had drawn for the reading were laid out in front of her, both looking up at her, judging her, blaming her. She squeezed her eyes shut. Of course Aurora didn't want anything to do with her. Can you really blame her? Adele took in a ragged breath as the tears she'd been fighting all night finally won out. "After what you did and all the lies that you've told her? Were you ever going to tell her what really happened to her parents?" Tears began dripping slowly off Adele's chin and plopping on the faces of her cards. Death gazed up at her from his white horse, bearing his scythe menacingly. The dark hollows where his eyes should be felt like they were boring through her in the flickering candlelight. "Why are you still here, Adele? Why haven't you ended it yet? Gaia knows you should. She wants you to. The world would be better off with one less murderer, one less liar." Adele whimpered aloud, and the break in silence in the house made her jump. She stared at the candle flickering lightly in the drafty bedroom. The gauzy curtains shifted lazily on either side of the window. Adele stood slowly and methodically pulled the curtains closed over the candle. She sat back down, cross-legged, with her cards spread out in front of her. Besides death lay the tower, looming over a burning landscape in all its crumbling glory. She still had the third card to pull. She took in another ragged breath, tears drying on her cheeks. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the deck. The beautiful galleyscape looking at her brought her none of the comfort it usually did. It felt like time slowed to a crawl as she laid the card face up on the reading cloth. The curtain shifted against the flame of the ever-flickering candle, and the thin fabric caught quickly. The fool gazed up at Adele as the curtain burned. Her time to wallow in self-loathing had come to an end. Her cards had nothing new to show her anymore. She gathered the cards back in their pouch and retrieved her diary from the drawer in her nightstand. She opened the journal to the last entry and scribbled a quick note on the empty page next to it. The flames licked at the windowsill, and the old peeling flowery wallpaper caught next. The room began to quickly fill with wisps of smoke. Adele coughed, and her eyes began to water as she gathered up the cards in the journal and stood up. She went to the hall, down the stairs, to the giant old cabinet that had been a constant in her life since before she could remember. She opened up the middle right cubby and put the journal and cards inside. Finally, she clasped the silver chain that had lived on her neck for the last 20 years. There was a simple silver pentagram hanging off the chain, with a single moonstone crystal in the center of the star. She had been drawn to it ages ago, when she first discovered tarot in the depths of her spirituality. It was her most cherished possession, second only to her cards. She squeezed the pendant a final time, and then placed the necklace gently in the velvet pouch with the cards, and made her way slowly back up the stairs into her room. By the time she opened the door back up and stepped inside the room, heavy smoke billowed out in a thick curtain around her, and the flames had all consumed the outside wall. She coughed again, her lungs burning. She closed the door and locked herself inside the raging hellscape. The leaves of a plant hanging from the ceiling by the window caught fire, and an inflamed ivy leaf plummeted to the shag carpet. It ignited almost immediately, blooming with fire and eating a hole into the floor that grew steadily in circumference. Adele's wrinkled brow broke into sweat as the temperature began increasing in the small room at a steady rate. "Gaia, please forgive me. Please watch over Aurora. Let her know that I love her, and that I'm sorry." The flames consumed her and the rest of the bedroom, and her screams were lost in the roar of the fire as it slowly worked its way through the rest of the house. Chapter 1. The Aftermath. I was lost. The room was dark, and smoke curled into the air from every corner. I coughed, covering my mouth and nose with the inside of my elbow. My eyes watered. I wrapped my hand around the brass knob of the door and immediately pulled it back with a yelp. The flesh of my palm stung fiercely from the burn, forcing me to shake it out. I placed my other palm flat against the door. It was warm, almost hot to the touch. Looking at the floor revealed the source of the smoke as it billowed in from beneath the door. The hardwood on the other side glowed orange, and I heard snapping and popping as the flames consumed the hall outside the door. "Aurora," a voice whispered in my ear, causing my skin to prickle with goosebumps. I coughed again, searching desperately for the source of the voice. "Hello?" My voice cracked from inhaling so much of the smoke. "Aurora, help me." The whisper came again in my other ear. I squeezed my eyes shut, and the tears rolled down my cheeks as they continued to water. "Where are you? I can't get to you." I pounded my fist on the door, and it rattled in its frame. My voice was hoarse and my throat burned. The smoke was so thick in the room now that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I coughed and choked down the smoke, collapsing to my knees and clutching my chest. The flames licked hungrily from beneath the door and caught the carpet in the bedroom. Fire bloomed on the fibers as they dissolved into ashes just as fast as they were ignited. A ring of fire formed around me, and the ring was shrinking quickly. "Aurora," I heard the desperate whisper in both ears as the flames began lapping at my feet and legs. Aurora sat straight up from her coworker's couch, her chest heaving. Her black V-neck shirt was cold and damp with sweat and clung to her ample chest and the rest of her torso. She closed her eyes and put her face in her hands. This was the 4th night in a row that her sleep had been plagued by this nightmare. She took a deep, steadying breath as her heart rate began to return to normal. She unfolded herself off the broken-down couch and grabbed her phone off the coffee table littered with empty and half-empty beer cans and bottles. The apartment was quiet, a significant change from earlier in the night when it had been packed full of dancing bodies. The only sound that could be heard now were ones of sleep, grunts and snores from the partygoers that had been too intoxicated to drive home. Aurora rubbed her eyes with her free hand as she thumbed the button on her phone to bring up her lock screen. 4 missed calls from Graham and 4 voicemails. Aurora swiped her thumb up on the phone screen, opening up her call log. The last call came in over an hour ago. She took her phone off vibrate and pushed the notifications for the voicemails. She put the phone to her ear, and the automated voice reiterated that she had 4 unheard messages, and then began playing them, starting with the oldest that came in while she had been at work the night before. Her grandmother's voice came through the phone in her usual tired cadence. "Hi, Rory. It's Graham. I just wanted to know if you wanted to come hang out with your grandma tonight. Your room is still just like you left it. I haven't changed a thing. This old house just feels too big today. Thinking about you. Love you." Aurora pinched the bridge of her nose and closed her eyes. Her relationship with her grandmother since she had moved out at 18 was rocky at best. Now at 20, they barely spoke. Aurora went over once a week to have dinner with her, but that wasn't due until Friday. She rolled her eyes, deleted the message, and played the next 2. With each message, Aurora could hear a slight change in her grandmother's voice. It sounded like she was holding back tears. The final message played, and something about it made Aurora's skin crawl with goosebumps. "Hi, Rory. It's Grandma again. Sorry to keep bugging you, babe. This old house is really just rattling me tonight. If you could come and hang out, I would really appreciate the company. I just really don't want to be alone tonight." Aurora paused, and the automated voice asked her if she wanted to delete the message. Something nagged at her. She hung up on the voicemail without deleting it. She hoisted herself off the couch trying to eat her and shuffled into the kitchen to open the fridge. It was nearing 7 a.m., but she grabbed a beer. a breakfast of champions. She chuckled and pulled off the top of the bottle. She drank half of it in 2 swallows, then took a breath and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She yawned, stretched her arms over her head, and lifted up onto her tiptoes, working the sleep out of her body as she slowly woke up. She took another swig of beer as she made her way back to the living room to find her shoes and her purse. The party had been a last-minute decision. She wasn't generally fond of her coworkers, but she was never one to turn down free booze. "Aha," she whispered in triumph. She had found her battered pink high-top sneakers and her boho-style bag underneath a pile of others' shoes at the foot of the bed in the guest room that housed all of the guests' coats and jackets. She took a moment to slip on her shoes and then swiped her sweater she'd brought that had been balled up under her bag. "Okay, Graham, I'm coming. Jesus, calm your tits." She made her way to the front door as she dug around in her purse with her one hand and finished her beer with the other. She came up with the keys and set the empty beer bottle on the side table by the front door, already covered totally with its predecessors. A crumpled can teetered off the table and landed on the hardwood floor with a clang. There was a stir from behind the couch, a snore, and then the apartment settled back down into silence as Aurora stepped out onto the landing outside. The morning air was frigid, and she shivered as she pulled her sweater over her head. She yanked the sleeves down over her palms, comforted almost immediately by the soft, frayed fabric against her skin. The front of the forest green sweater had the fading image of a hand making a peace sign. She hit the button on her key fob, and her beat-up Camry honked at her from the parking lot below. Making her way down the stairs, she noticed a butterfly fluttering around her car. Her brow furrowed. A butterfly. When it's nearing November, its wings were a beautiful sapphire blue. Unlike every other butterfly she'd ever come in contact with, this one was not afraid of her. She put her hand on the door handle, and it landed gently on her knuckles. "No free rides, little guy. Sorry." Aurora fluttered her fingers and opened up her door. The butterfly did another lap around her car, and then she lost it among the shrubs and flowers along the side of the parking lot. She shook her head and chuckled to herself. As she climbed into the driver's seat, the weirdness with the butterfly wore off and she began to feel annoyed with her grandmother. Didn't she understand that Aurora had her own life? That she had set up that weekly schedule for a reason, and she couldn't just come over at the drop of a pin just because the old house creaks? The Camry whined to life and she pulled out of her spot. "May as well stop and grab some coffee. The hangover is going to be a bitch." As if on cue, her temples began to pound steadily. She groaned as she pulled onto the highway. She jammed her fingers against the radio's power button, and the song that had been playing when she turned the car off picked up where it had been cut off. She tapped her thumbs on the steering wheel with the beat of some rock song that she couldn't remember the name of. She sang along with the last part of the chorus and tried not to think about how much she related to the words. "Pretty sure there's nobody praying for me either," Aurora said solemnly as she turned into the gas station parking lot and stopped at a pump. Her gas gauge had been hovering just over empty for the last few days, and she just couldn't put off filling it up anymore. She sighed as she got out and hummed the rest of the song as she walked inside. The heat was cranked, and it amplified the smell of cardboard and body odor. She wrinkled her nose, making a beeline for the coffee station. "I don't give a fuck what you want. I said no. Go get in the car." Aurora's ears bristled as she passed a haggard-looking man and what seemed to be his daughter in the candy aisle. The dad was on his phone, and he had a candy bar in his hand. The little girl looked to be about 6. Her hair was pulled into lazy pigtails, and her clothes were stained and tattered. She pouted her lips and begged again. "Daddy, please! Can't I have one too?" The dad cut his eyes to his daughter, and he raised his hand as if to strike her until he saw Aurora paused at the end of the aisle. The little girl cowered and pushed past Aurora. She could hear her crying as she exited the store. "The fuck are you looking at?" Aurora swallowed hard and averted her gaze. Nothing. Sorry," she stammered and hurried to get her coffee. She busied herself with adding the cream and sugar as the dad went up to the counter, bought a pack of cigarettes in addition to the candy bar, and left. Aurora blew air between her lips in a huff. Her hand shook as she fumbled with the spout to allow the hot brew to fill almost to the brim of the styrofoam. Why had that affected her so badly? The look in his eyes. It woke a fear in her that she didn't understand. She tried to shake it off and decided coffee wasn't what she needed. She abandoned the cup on the counter and went to the aisle with the liquor. She grabbed a pint bottle of her favorite Blue Label vodka. The clerk behind the counter raised her eyebrow at Aurora's purchase as she set the bottle on the checkout counter. "Starting early, huh?" Aurora didn't miss a beat in her response. "Never stopped. Can I get a pack of Marlboro Blacks and 15 on pump 5 also?" The clerk blinked at her, giving her a judging look as she turned to get the cigarettes and ring everything up. "Mm-hmm. You need a bag, sugar?" Aurora put a few bills on the counter and pocketed the smokes. "Nah, I'm good, thanks." She grabbed the bottle and pushed her way out the door, ignoring the clerk calling her about her change. The chilly air cut through her tattered sweater, and she shivered as she went back to her car. She couldn't get that scared little girl out of her head. She unhooked the pump and put the nozzle to her tank. Why had that bothered her so much? She felt the faint echo of a memory begin to piece itself together in her mind as she watched the price crawl by a cent at a time. A couch. I remember the scratchy, uncomfortable tweed fabric of the old couch. I always hated it. It made me itch and always stank from Daddy's cigars. But tonight, it was my hiding place. Mommy and Daddy were fighting again, and I knew that I had to stay out of their way. Mommy came home late, and Daddy had been drinking all day. I shifted to keep my legs from falling asleep, and bumped my arm against the scratchy fabric. I winced. That bruise was just a couple days old. It still hurt. Once they turn yellow, they don't hurt so much anymore. The gas pump beeped and shut off, ripping Aurora from the unfamiliar memory. She shook her wild, sandy blonde curls out, trying to rid herself of the bad feeling lingering in her bones. She placed the pump in its cradle and put the cap back on the tank. She threw the pack of cigarettes in the glove box with the bottle of vodka and got her last cigarette out of the old pack in the passenger seat. Her hand trembled as she flicked her lighter and took a drag. Maybe I could talk to Grandma about the daydream. She pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the main road. Traffic was light and the stoplights liked her today, so she made it to her grandmother's neighborhood within just a few minutes. As she pulled onto her street, the smell of smoke drifted through the crack in her window she'd made to ash her cigarette. It smelled wrong, like someone had burned a pile of wood and metal and plastic. She flicked the last half of her cigarette out the window and closed the gap. She got in the glove box as she pulled up to the curb outside her grandmother's house to get the bottle of vodka out and put it in a flask that she kept in her purse. When she looked up at the house, she dropped the unopened bottle onto the floorboard. "Gram!" She bolted out of the car and up the front walk. There was a fire truck parked on the other side of the driveway on the curb, and the ambulance backed into the driveway, doors open. A firefighter came out of the house to greet her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you can't—" "Is she okay?" Aurora tried to run past to the crew member, but he wrapped an arm around her to hold her back. "Did you know the victim, ma'am?" Aurora's blood ran cold. "Victim? She's my grandmother. Is she okay? Please, I have to see her." The EMT guided her out of the yard and pulled off his mask and helmet. The look on his face was one of concern. "Ma'am, it's not a good idea. She didn't make it. The fire seems to have started from a candle in her room." Aurora's knees buckled, and she fought the EMT as he tried to help her. He was speaking, but Aurora wasn't hearing anything he was saying. The only sound she heard was the pounding of her heart in her ears. She looked past him, up at the house, and her breath felt trapped in her chest. The part of the house that was her grandmother's room and her own room next to it was completely gutted. The roof had collapsed, and what hadn't burned away was hanging precariously from the back of the house that hadn't been affected by the flames. The outside wall on the second floor was entirely gone, and the walls of Aurora's room and her grandmother's were black with smoke damage. The only thing that was whole in either of the rooms were the metal bed frames. No longer silver in color, but black and warped. Both of their dressers were burned and broken down, and the full-length mirror that had been in Aurora's room was caked with smoke and cracked beyond repair. "Ma'am? Ma'am!" Aurora blinked, and her vision swam with unshed tears. The EMT gripped her shoulders and shook her gently. Her feet felt rooted on the ground, and a million questions rattled around in her head. What was the real reason she was trying to call me before she died? Her voice in the last message she left. Could I have stopped this? She's been burning candles and incense since she was my age. How could she have let a candle catch on anything? I'm gonna go sit in my car. Aurora willed her legs to move, to let her go to safety of her car, to her bottle. The EMT called after her, asking if she was okay and if he needed to call anyone for her. She was the last person that I had in my life. There is no one else. I'm all alone now. Aurora felt like she was on autopilot as she made her way back through the yard to her car. She wanted to explore the house and do her own investigating, and obviously the EMS and fire team weren't going to let her do that. She picked up the bottle of vodka from the floorboard after she'd gotten herself sat down and the door shut. She felt numb as she twisted off the lid and drank down 2 shots straight from the bottle. She squeezed her eyes shut, and the tears that she had been holding back and trying to keep under control overflowed from her like a floodgate busted open. She blubbered and sobbed and drank. By the time the fire crews and EMS pulled off the property, half the pint was gone, and Aurora was feeling very floaty. She stumbled out of the car and back into the yard. She got as far as the front porch before she threw up in her grandmother's rosebush. "Sorry, Gram." She wiped her mouth with the sleeve of her sweater and looked up at the house for a 3rd time. She slowly put one foot in front of the other and forced herself to climb the front steps. The old mossy green door that she had come in and out of so many times growing up looked sad as it sagged on its hinges. The heat from the fire had expanded the door frame, and now it didn't fit around the door like it should. Aurora pushed gently on the wood and it creaked open. Immediately upon setting foot in the front room, she was overwhelmed by her grandmother's scent. Lavender and vanilla wrapped itself around her and filled her nose with memories. To the right of the front door was the living room, the big bay window overlooking the front yard that she would sit in and do homework every night after dinner. The love seat that her grandmother frequented and would fall asleep in most nights sat across the window in front of the ancient box of a television, with its rabbit ear antenna forming a V above it. Aurora sat on the faded, overly stuffed ottoman in front of the window as she remembered one of the last serious conversations she had with her grandmother. She had been about 13, and she was doing a report on different religions. "Grandma, who is Gaia?" My grandmother muted Murder, She Wrote and looked at me thoughtfully from her spot on the couch. "Now that's a big question. Doing something for school?" I nodded and held up a notebook and pen. "We have to do a report in social studies on different religions. Is Gaia your religion?" Grandma chuckled and shifted her position on the couch, tucking her feet up under her. "Well, yes and no. I would go so far as to say that I don't follow any one religion, but I am very spiritual, and Gaia is my guide through my spirituality." The puzzled look on my face made Grandma elaborate. "There's a difference between following a religion and being spiritual, believe it or not. Religion is generally followed by a large group of people, and it has a lot of rules. It's very organized, like Christianity. That's a religion. Spirituality is more of an individual practice. It's all about finding a sense of purpose and having inner peace." The grandmother's eyes sparkled as she took a breath. I was hooked on every word. "Gaia is a goddess in the Greek pantheon. She's the mother of all other gods and goddesses, and she's mother of Earth. There are some that even believe that she is the Earth. A follower of hers practice love and compassion, peace and kindness to animals and nature." Grandma got up and then went to the large cabinet at the base of the stairs by the front door. The cabinet was massive and made of dark oak. It had been in my grandmother's family for hundreds of years. Grandma says it came over to the United States all the way from Germany when her grandma was a young girl. She opened up one of the many square doors and produced a small statue that she cradled in her hands as if it were made of the most fragile of glass. It was the color of the forest floor, and it was a woman, sitting cross-legged with her hands lovingly cradling a pregnant belly. Her eyes were closed, and she had a tranquil look on her stone face. Her stomach was painted to look like the earth. Grandma came back over to me and handed me the statue. I took it gently, turning it over in my hands, feeling its weight. She was beautiful. I handed it back to Grandma at once, not wanting to risk dropping it. She set it on the empty space on the console table, acting as an entertainment center beside the TV. Gaia has been with me for many, many years. I feel her everywhere and in everything I do. I know that whatever happens, I'll always have her to lean on. That's spirituality. I tapped my pen against my chin, chewing on Grandma's words. Then a realization hit me. That's how I feel about Avery. Is Gaia like having a best friend? Grandma chuckled and planted a kiss on the top of my head. Avery Marino was my best friend since 3rd grade and lived in the house next door. She was leaving at the end of the school year to go to Italy for the summer, and I had no idea what I was going to do until she got back. In many ways, yes, it's exactly like that. I would call Gaia my best friend, though our relationship can feel one-sided at times, because I'm here on Earth and she's on another plane. I gave her a funny look. What kind of plane? Like an airplane? This made her laugh out loud, a good hearty laugh that I hadn't heard from her in quite a while. Oh, darling girl, no, not at all like an airplane. Many people, myself included, believe that the universe consists of different planes. She motioned for my pen and my notebook. I moved to sit next to her on the couch. She took my pen, and on a blank piece of paper, she drew one flat disc in the center of the paper. Just above the disc, she drew 3 similar discs, and then below the center disc, she did the same thing. When she was done, there were 7 discs spanning the length of the paper. So, this plane here, she pointed with the pen to the disc in the center, this is our plane. Everything that we know is here, our reality. Then, she pointed to the disc above and below our disc in the center. These discs here, these are other realities. They're similar to ours, but no one but the gods and goddesses that watch over us know what exists in them. Are you following so far? I nodded, enthralled by the words my grandmother was weaving. She took the pen and made squiggly marks in the spaces between the discs. Now, this space, this is what's called the astral plane. A lot of spirit guides reside here to help souls that have lost their way. My eyes widened in awe. Does everyone have a spirit guide? I began imagining witches and wizards watching over everything I did. Grandma became thoughtful. I believe there is a guide for everyone out there somewhere, yes. It's just a matter of whether or not the person is open to receiving the guidance. I had so many more questions bouncing around in my head, but the clock above the archway in the kitchen chimed 8 o'clock. My grandma patted my knee. That's enough for tonight. Go get washed up for bed. We can talk more tomorrow, okay? I nodded and kissed my grandmother on the cheek. Her skin smelled faintly of her homemade perfume of lavender and vanilla, and it kissed my nostrils and gave me a warm, comforting feeling. Aurora wiped the tears from her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweater. It was damp from how many times she had done that in the last hour. So much good you did her, Gaia, she said bitterly. She took a deep, steadying breath and turned to walk out of the house. Instead, she came upon a cabinet looming at the bottom of the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat like a rock, and she swallowed hard around it. The stairwell was completely ruined and falling apart. The 2nd floor had caved in on the landing of the stairs, and the 2nd flight had crumbled into a heap. The wall around the stairs was black and charred, but the smoke and fire damage looked as if it had hit a stone wall right next to where the cabinet sat. It was completely untouched by the smoke. It looked as it always had, big and menacing, with its thick, smoky glass panes in each of the small square doors all the way across and down the front of the cabinet. At the bottom, there were 4 long rectangular drawers. All of the handles and hinges on the doors and drawers were wrought iron and twisted elegantly into a classic C shape. Aurora was drawn to the cabinet, even though it unnerved her. It was as if it had its own field of gravity, pulling her closer until she stopped in front of it, eye level with the very middle cabinet. Through the glass, she could see something stacked neatly in the small cubby. Curiosity got the best of her, and she opened it up. The only thing in this particular cubby was the well-used moleskin journal that was the color of a faded denim, and a palm-sized smoky gray velvet pouch that had a pentagram embroidered on the front of it. The drawstrings on the pouch had been pulled closed over the contents inside and tied loosely. Aurora picked up the items carefully, and then looked at the cubby directly to the right of the one that she had just opened. She opened this one as well and gasped. Sitting just exactly where it had been when her grandmother had taken it out nearly a decade ago was the statue of Gaia. The look of tranquility on the statue's face that she had seen when she was a teen looked to be one of sorrow now. As bitter as she felt toward the goddess, she couldn't just leave the statue. She scooped it up with the pouch and the journal. She held the items to her chest as if she were lost at sea, and the only thing keeping her afloat were the things that her grandmother had left behind. She felt suddenly ill again. as if she would have another incident with the rosebush, and walked carefully out of the house. She had no idea what was going to happen with the rest of the things in the house. She supposed that would be a problem for the future Aurora. And she's an asshole, Aurora muttered as she came down the front steps and back to her car. The sun was higher in the sky than when she had first arrived, but the late October air was still chilly. Movement in front of the car caught her eye, and she saw the same sapphire blue butterfly fluttering around the front part of the yard. She walked slowly around her car, eyeing the insect. "Are you following me?" She narrowed her eyes at the butterfly that swooped down close to her face and then away. She felt ridiculous, being suspicious of a butterfly. She shook her head, placed the items gently in the passenger seat, and got herself situated behind the wheel. Her head spun, and she felt lightheaded as she attempted to turn the car back on. She really shouldn't be driving, but she couldn't sit in front of this house anymore with all of the memories and nostalgia. She swallowed back vomit as she pulled away from the curb and made her way slowly out of her grandmother's neighborhood. The butterfly lingered in the road, fluttering in place until Aurora's car was out of sight, and then it flittered away with the breeze. "You're the reason she's dead, Aurora." Aurora jerked the wheel suddenly, taken by surprise by the severity of the negative thought. Her hands began to quiver as she tried to steady herself and bring her focus back to the highway in front of her. That was ridiculous. She hadn't been the one to strike the match. "But you're the reason, Aurora. If you had bothered to answer your phone, she would still be alive." Aurora gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She jammed her finger on the power button on the radio and spun the volume dial all the way to the right. The rock music blared through the speakers and enveloped her, drowning out everything but the lyrics of "Bullet for My Valentine's," "Tears Don't Fall." Aurora's vision blurred with unshed tears, and she swallowed the rock that was forming in her throat. "You're a worthless drunk, Aurora. Your grandmother is dead because you wanted free booze." Aurora sobbed audibly, and she reached for the bottle of vodka that had fallen down between the center console and the driver's seat. She managed to get it free, uncapped, and to her lips with one hand. She finished the bottle as if it were water instead of liquor. Her throat burned as she threw the empty pint on the floorboard and coughed. She blinked rapidly as her vision doubled. She felt the car begin to drift into the oncoming lane. "The world would be a better place with one less drunk in it, Aurora." An 18-wheeler crested over the horizon in the distance. Aurora felt dizzy as the alcohol went to her head. She had drifted completely into the oncoming lane, and the semi was coming up fast. Aurora stared into the grill of the oncoming big rig. Her vision blurred, and her eyelids suddenly felt like they were made of lead. The driver of the semi laid on the horn, and Aurora's eyes flew open. The grill had filled up the windshield almost completely. Aurora screamed and jerked the steering wheel hard to the right. Horns blared as she crossed back into the correct lane of traffic and flew over the embankment. Her Camry crashed through the overgrown bush until it was suddenly and violently stopped by a large tree. The front end wrapped itself around the base of the tree, and the hood folded inward like it was made of paper. The windshield splintered but didn't shatter. Aurora's seatbelt kept her from going through the broken windshield, but the force with which she stopped threw her head first into a steering wheel. The airbags deployed and shot Aurora back to an upright position in the seat before slowly deflating. Her body went slack against the window as she fell unconscious. There was a steady hiss as the radiator and engine began to leak steam and fluid. White smoke rose from the wreckage in a thin line until a breeze picked up and carried the smoke away. I was in the burning house again, except this time I knew which room I was in. There was just enough light coming in through the blinds for me to see the faded flowery wallpaper that covered the walls in my grandmother's room. "Aurora!" The whisper came from all around me, and unlike before, I recognized the cry for help immediately. My grandmother sounded very far away and desperate. I went to the door and tried the handle, and like before, I came back with a burned palm. "I can't get to you. Where are you? Grandma!" I beat on the door so hard it rattled in its frame. "Aurora, I can't get to you." My eyes and lungs burned from the smoke slowly filling the room from beneath the crack in the door. I continued beating on the door, calling for my grandmother to no avail. Grandma, please! Why did you do this? Why did you leave me?" My throat constricted as tears blurred my vision and fell in twin rivers down my cheeks. The only response that I got was the flame licking at the carpet from beneath the door. The carpet caught, and the ring of fire entrapped me. Except this time, instead of the ring shrinking around me, the bedroom door flew open with a large gust of foul-smelling wind. A shadow figure blocked my escape. It was as tall as the door frame, and not quite as wide. A pair of steel gray eyes opened and cut through me like daggers. A different, unfamiliar masculine voice whispered around me. "Come, Aurora. You are lost." I fell to my knees and screamed, clutching both sides of my head as the fire consumed me. Aurora woke herself up with her screams. She was still in her wrecked car off the highway, except the sun had started to dip below the horizon and the temperature had dropped significantly. She pulled her arms inside of her sweater and wrapped them around her middle, shivering violently. Her head pounded, and she could feel a very tender lump forming just under her hairline where she had struck the steering wheel. She groaned, and only then did she take notice of how eerily quiet the world was around her. She looked to the passenger seat and momentarily freaked out when she saw the empty seat, but then she noticed that the journal, pouch, and statue were in a pile on the floorboard. She let the breath free that she didn't realize she was holding. Her phone was in her bag, and it was blissfully not dead. She opened up her internet browser and did a search for the nearest towing company and came up with Floyd's Towing and Automotive Repair and dialed the number. It only rang twice. "Floyd's Towing and Repair. This is Floyd. What can I do for you?" The man's voice was gruff and sounded as if he had a very thin patience. Aurora swallowed hard and tried to focus on not slurring her words. Hi, I was in an accident, I think. I think I'm off Highway 9. I'm down an embankment. I hit a tree. Can you..." Aurora bit back her tears. Can you please help me get home?" When Lloyd spoke again, his voice had gone up an octave and he sounded concerned. "Okay, yeah, I can help you. But can you be a little more specific of where you're at? Can you give me a mile marker?" Aurora looked behind her up toward the highway. A thin green rectangle of a sign told her that she had crashed right after mile marker 118. Mile marker 118. Ugh! Suddenly, she felt exhausted and her knees buckled. She landed in a heap beside the car. Ma'am, are you okay? Were you injured? Do you need an ambulance?" Aurora's world spun and threatened to make her ill. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the rear driver's side door. No ambulance, okay? I'm just tired. It hurts. And a rest. Please, hurry." Aurora thumbed the hang-up button and her phone slipped from her grip as she began to lose consciousness. The world was quiet as she slipped into a fitful sleep. I skipped into the house and dropped my bag by the stairs, desperate to ask Grandma about Avery's party that night. She was turning 14, and her mom was going to let boys come over as well as girls. We had been planning the evening all day today between classes and during lunch. "Grandma, where are you?" I smelled potatoes the further I walked into the living room. "In the kitchen, Rory." I barreled through the living room and into the kitchen. Grandma was standing in front of the stove, bent over a boiling pot and stirring occasionally. Her long silver hair was in its usual braid down her back, and she was wearing her gardening clothes. She gave me a stern look from over the rims of her square frames. "Aurora Sky, you know how I feel about you running through the house." I leaned up against the counter behind her, my hands tucked sheepishly behind my back. "Sorry, Gram. I'm just really excited for Avery's party tonight. I can go, can't I?" Grandma suddenly became very focused on her boiling pot of potatoes, and she didn't answer for what felt like ages. "Will her parents be there?" I bit my lip and thought about lying. I decided against it. "Well, no. They're going to go on a date. Avery's a good girl. Grandma, you know that." Grandmother looked miles away as she absently turned the wooden spoon in the boiling water. "You can go, but no drinking. I may be old, but I know what goes on at parties these days. If I even catch the slightest whiff of alcohol on your breath, I'll tan your hide 6 ways to Sunday." I hugged my arms around her neck and planted a big kiss on her cheek. "Thank you, Grandma. No drinking. Got it. I promise." Aurora groaned as she slowly regained consciousness. The night air was cold against her face, and she must have still been fuzzy from the alcohol because she felt the world rocking back and forth. "Are you okay?" "Oh, Christ, thank you, Jesus." Aurora slowly opened her eyes and took in her surroundings. She was being held, cradled almost, which explained the rocking back and forth. Whoever had a hold of her was taking her uphill. and they weren't very graceful. She saw the stars in the sky above her, winking lazily, and then a shadowed face with bright green eyes staring down at her. She started to scream, and her captor began to wobble unsteadily on their feet. Whoa, it's okay, you're not in danger. My name is Floyd. I'm the tow guy, remember? Aurora's breath came in gasps as she tried to get a hold of herself. Her memory was foggy at best, but she did recall making a phone call. The crash. Oh, well, could you put me down at least? She said dumbly. Floyd obliged, having reached the top of the embankment. Aurora's feet touched down on the asphalt, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Floyd's truck was parked just a few feet away on the side of the road. You were all slumped over, and I thought that maybe you'd been hurt. I was taking you up to my truck here to call an ambulance. Aurora pulled her sweater tight around her and shivered. It was fully dark now, and the air was frigid. It was made worse by the occasional breeze that was whipped up and thrown at her from the passing vehicles on the highway. Well, thanks, Floyd, but I'm okay. Just exhausted is all. I would just really like to get home. Floyd nodded, his shaggy mahogany hair shining in the moonlight. He had an oafish charm to him. His coveralls were baggy and covered in grime and grease. He towered over her, and she suddenly realized just how alone she was, in the middle of the night with a stranger. She shivered again, but this time it wasn't from the cold. It won't take but a minute to get you hitched up and ready to go, darling. If you want to wait here, he winked at her and put his giant hand on her shoulder. Aurora chewed on her lip nervously and shrugged out from under Floyd's grasp. Yeah, that sounds fine, thanks. She was incredibly uncomfortable, and she began pacing in a small circle on the side of the highway. Her head pounded in time with the heartbeat, and her stomach roiled angrily. She was hungry and nauseous and aching for a drink as her head began to clear, and her reality came crashing back to the forefront of her mind. Floyd grabbed the chains from his truck and clambered back down the embankment. There was a loud chunk, followed by a rattle, and then Floyd's hulking figure came up onto the side of the road once again. Go on and get in the truck. I'll get y'all squared away here. With that, Floyd walked to the back of his truck and hit the button. The chains started rolling themselves back up, pulling the boar Camry slowly out of the woods. Aurora stumbled to the passenger side of the truck and looked up at the door that seemed miles away. She closed her eyes and swayed. With the car safely hitched to the back of the truck, Floyd came around to her side and chuckled at her still standing on the road. Need some help up there, darling? Aurora swallowed her pride and nodded. She couldn't help that she was only 5'8". Floyd popped her door open, and without even asking first, he hooked his hand under her ass and hoisted her up onto the seat, like she was a sack of flour. She thought his hand lingered a tad long on her rear, and she very quickly got herself seated and strapped into the seat. All set? Alrighty, let's get you home, girl. Floyd shut her door and meandered his way around to the front of the truck to his side. The truck rocked as he climbed into the driver's seat and got situated. Aurora gave him the address of her apartment complex, and he started up the truck with a rumble. The cab shook slightly as he made his way onto the highway, and Aurora's stomach rolled dangerously. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe through her nose. Hey, you okay? Floyd asked, and Aurora felt his hand on her shoulder. Yeah, I'm fine. She ducked her shoulder out from under his hand and scooted closer to the door. When she opened her eyes, she saw that Floyd was looking at her with an intensity that had made her skin crawl. Suddenly, she regretted getting in his truck. Sardonically, she chimed, A drink would be nice, though. She thought longingly of the abandoned bottle of vodka, probably still sitting in the ditch that she'd been carried out of. Floyd reached out his hand, and she flinched away. But he just flicked a poker chip hanging on the rearview mirror and said, Sorry, girlie. Haven't had me a drink in over 30 years. That shit is poison. Aurora's throat was painfully dry, and she tried wetting it with her saliva to no avail. Her world began to spin, and Floyd gave her a sideways glance. If you're thirsty, I got some bottled water at your feet there, he said concerningly. Aurora shook her head. She gripped the edge of the seat on either side of her denim-clad legs. She was done being in this truck cab, and she was overcome with relief when her apartment complex came into view. Floyd reached out his hand for her again. If you ever feel like you need help, you can call me. I'm actually going to a meeting after this. Aurora recoiled from his grasp and flattened herself against the door. She had to get out of here, had to get away from him. She felt the curve of the door handle beneath her fingers. Leaving one hand on the door, she went to scratch at her side. In one motion, she clicked the button to release the seat belt and hooked her fingers under the door handle and pulled. It popped and swung out over the ditch next to the highway. Floyd hollered at her, and she felt him grab for her shirt, so she rolled off the bench seat and into the chilly night. There was a moment when she felt weightless, and she actually closed her eyes with the serenity of it. The moment quickly ended with a sharp crack of her head colliding with a rock, and she tumbled through the tall grass, finally coming to rest on the bottom of the ditch. Her world went quiet and dark as she slipped beneath the waves of unconsciousness for the third time that night.